The autumn rain fell like tears of angels upon the cobblestones of Paris, each droplet carrying whispers of betrayal that only the shadows seemed to understand. In the highest tower of the Louvre, King Philip IV stood before a window of colored glass, his pale fingers pressed against the cold surface as he gazed down upon his kingdom. The year was 1306, and the realm of France trembled beneath the weight of debt and divine ambition. "Your Majesty," came a voice from behind, soft as silk yet sharp as a dagger's edge. Guillaume de Nogret emerged from the darkness of the chamber, his black robes seeming to absorb what little light the flickering candles provided. The king's chief minister moved with the calculated grace of a predator, his every step deliberate, his every word measured. "The preparations are nearly complete." Philip did not turn from the window. Below, the narrow streets of Paris wound, like serpents between timber-framed houses that leaned precariously toward each other, their upper stories nearly touching across the muddy lanes. The smell of wood smoke, rotting fish, and human waste rose even to this height, mingling with the incense that burned eternally in the royal chambers. Yet beneath these familiar scents, Philip detected something else, the metallic tang of approaching violence. Nearly, the king's voice carried the ice of winter storms. "Nogret, when I speak of the destruction of the temple, I do not speak in terms of nearly. I speak in terms of absolute certainty." The minister bowed his head, though his dark eyes never left the king's reflection in the glass. "Forgive me, sire, the final preparations require delicacy. The Templars have eyes and ears throughout the kingdom. Even now, their spies watch our every move." Philip finally turned, his gaunt face illuminated by the dancing flames of a dozen candles. The shadows carved deep lines around his eyes, making him appear older than his 38 years. Golden hair fell in waves to his shoulders, and his pale blue eyes held the cold fire of ambition. He wore robes of deep purple trimmed with ermine, and upon his finger gleamed the great seal of France, a ring that had blessed crusades and condemned heretics. "Let them watch," Philip said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let Jacques D. Molay and his warrior monks believe themselves secure in their fortress temple. Let them count their gold and polish their swords. Soon, very soon, they will learn that no earthly power can stand against the divine right of kings." The chamber around them spoke of power accumulated over generations. Tapestries depicting the victories of French kings adorned the stone walls, their threads woven with gold that caught the candlelight and threw it back in shimmering patterns. A great oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with maps, letters sealed with red wax, and documents written in the careful script of royal clerks. The very air seemed heavy with conspiracy. Nogret moved closer, his footsteps muffled by thick carpets that had once graced the halls of Constantinople. "The charges have been prepared, Your Majesty. Heresy, blasphemy, denial of Christ, worship of idols, obscene rituals." He paused, savoring each word like fine wine. "And sodomy, of course. The people will demand their blood when they hear such accusations." "And the Pope?" Philip asked, though he already knew the answer. "His Holiness Clement remains cooperative. The message will reach him in Poitiers tomorrow. By the time he might consider objecting, the deed will be accomplished." Nogret's thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. A fait accompli as they say. Through the window, Philip could see the great walls of the temple fortress rising in the distance, its towers and battlements stark against the gray sky. Even from here, he could make out the white mantles of Templar knights moving along the ramparts, their red crosses visible like drops of blood upon fresh snow. For 2 centuries they had stood as the sword and shield of Christendom, their warrior monks fighting and dying in the Holy Land while amassing wealth and power that rivaled kings. "They think themselves untouchable," Philip murmured, his breath fogging the cold glass, "protected by papal bulls and sanctified by their sacred oaths. They have forgotten that earthly power must bow to earthly kings." The truth, though Philip would never speak it aloud, was more complex. The Templars held debts against the crown of France that could bankrupt the realm. Their treasure vaults contained gold enough to fund armies, their estates stretched across Europe like an invisible empire, and their knowledge included secrets that could shake the very foundations of Christendom. But it was not merely greed that drove the king's ambition. It was fear of what the Templars knew, what they possessed, and what they might do if their power continued to grow unchecked. "The orders have been distributed?" Philip asked, turning back to face his minister. "To every bailiff, every seneschal, every man who serves your crown," Nogret confirmed. "Sealed with your private seal and marked with the royal cipher. They are to be opened simultaneously at dawn on Friday, the 13th day of October. By the time the sun reaches its zenith, every Templar in France will be in chains." Friday the 13th. Philip found a certain poetic justice in the date, a day that would forever be marked in the chronicles of history. He moved to the great table and lifted one of the sealed orders, feeling its weight in his palm. The parchment was of the finest quality, the ink still dark and fresh, the wax seal bearing the fleur-de-lis of France pressed deep into the blood-red surface. "And if some escape the net?" he asked. Nogret's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "Then they will become hunted men, outcasts, and fugitives with no sanctuary in any Christian land. Their very survival will become testimony to their guilt." The king nodded slowly. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming against the glass, like the fingers of the damned seeking entrance. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled the hour, 9 strikes that echoed across the sleeping city. In the temple fortress, Jacques de Maillet was likely at prayer, kneeling before an altar dedicated to the glory of God, unaware that his God had already abandoned him to the mercy of earthly kings. "There is one matter more, your majesty," Nogret sighed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Our informants speak of certain ... artifacts that the Templars guard with particular care, relics and documents that they claim predate the founding of their order. Some say they contain knowledge that could change the very nature of our faith." Philip's eyes narrowed. Superstition and heresy. What matters is their gold, not their blasphemous trinkets. "Of course, sire," Nogret agreed, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "Though if such items exist, they would serve as additional evidence of their corruption." The king walked to the great fireplace, where logs burned with a warmth that could not quite chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. Above the mantel hung a sword, not his ceremonial blade, but a weapon of war, its edge still keen despite its age. It had belonged to his grandfather, Louis IX, who had died on crusade in the service of God and France. Saint Louis, they called him now, and Philip wondered what his saintly ancestor would think of the work to be done in the coming days. "Send word to Captain Alling de Pereils," Philip commanded. "His men are to secure the temple treasury first, before the arrests begin. I want every coin, every cup, every scrap of parchment accounted for and brought to the Louvre." "It shall be done, your Majesty." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the great chimney toward the night sky. Philip stared into the flames, seeing in their dancing light the destruction that would soon engulf the most powerful military order in Christendom. The Templars had grown too proud, too wealthy, too independent. They had forgotten that they were subjects first, monks second, and warriors third. "Leave me," Philip said at last. "There are prayers to be said before such work begins." Nagrit bowed deeply, his black robes rustling like the wings of some great bird of prey. "Your Majesty's will be done." He paused at the door, turning back, with that same cold smile. History will remember this as the day when France truly became master of her own destiny. When the minister had gone, Philip remained alone with the dancing shadows and the weight of what was to come. He knelt before a small altar in the corner of the chamber, where a golden crucifix caught the firelight and threw it back in brilliant rays. His lips moved in silent prayer, though whether he asked for forgiveness or for strength, even he could not say. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Paris clean for the blood that would soon stain them red. The pre-dawn darkness of October 13th lay over Paris like a burial shroud, thick and oppressive in the narrow streets that surrounded the temple fortress. Captain Alling de Pereils crouched in the shadow of Saint Martin de Champs, his mail hauberk cold against his chest beneath the royal tabard that marked him as the king's man. Around him, 200 knights and men-at-arms waited in perfect silence, their breathing visible in the chill air as small puffs of vapor that dissipated like souls departing from their bodies. The captain's weathered face bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, and his gray eyes held no warmth as he studied the sealed orders in his gaunted hands. The royal cipher was unmistakable, the wax seal unbroken, and the king's private mark visible in the corner. 3 small dots arranged in a triangle, known only to Philip's most trusted servants. In less than an hour, when the church bells rang prime, he would break that seal and learn the nature of his task. Though if the whispers in the castle were true, he already knew what manner of work awaited him this day. "Captain," came a whisper from beside him. Sergeant Henry Mallet, a grizzled veteran of the Flemish wars, pointed toward the temple walls with a scarred hand. Movement on the battlements. De Pereils followed his sergeant's gaze to the great fortress that rose before them. The temple was more than a monastery. It was a military stronghold that could house 1,000 knights, with walls 20 feet high and towers that scraped the belly of the sky. Even in the darkness, he could make out the white mantles of Templar sentries moving along the ramparts, their red crosses like wounds against the pale cloth. "They keep good watch," de Pereils murmured, "as warriors should." That was the tragedy of it, he reflected. These were not corrupt merchants or grasping clerics, but warriors who had shed their blood in the Holy Land, men who had stood against the Saracen tide when all seemed lost. Yet the king's will was absolute, and a soldier's duty was obedience, regardless of the nature of the task. The great bell of Notre Dame began to toll in the distance, its bronze voice carrying across the sleeping city. One strike, then another, calling the faithful to morning prayer. As the echoes died away, similar sounds arose from churches throughout Paris, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Saint-Eustache, Saint-Chapelle, a symphony of bronze that announced the arrival of a new day. De Prails broke the royal seal with his dagger, the wax cracking like breaking bones. The parchment crackled as he unfolded it, and even in the dim light he could make out the royal seal at the top and the careful script of the king's clerks below. As he read, his face remained impassive, though something cold settled in his stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. By the grace of God and the authority of Philip, King of France, the orders began. Know that the military order known as the Knights Templar stands accused of heresy, blasphemy, denial of Christ, our Savior, worship of idols, practice of obscene rituals, and the sin of sodomy. All members of this order within the realm of France are to be arrested and brought to trial before the Inquisition. Their properties are to be seized in the name of the crown, their assets secured, and their persons delivered to the proper authorities for examination. Let no man give them aid or comfort, on pain of sharing their fate. The captain rolled the parchment carefully and tucked it within his surcoat. Around him his men waited with the patience of professional soldiers, their hands resting easily on sword hilts, their eyes watching the fortress walls for any sign that their presence had been detected. These were veterans all, men who had served the crown in war and peace, who had stormed castles and put down rebellions. Yet even they seemed subdued by the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Sergeant Mallet, de Prails whispered, "Signal the other companies, it begins." 3 short whistles carried through the morning air, soft as bird calls but unmistakable to those who listened for them. Similar signals answered from the darkness surrounding the temple complex, from the church of Saint Gervais to the east, from the royal gardens to the west, from the warren of streets and alleys that enclosed the fortress like a noose. 500 men in total, all moving with the coordinated precision that only years of warfare could teach. Inside the temple, Jacques de Maillet knelt before the altar in the great chapel, his white hair gleaming in the light of votive candles that burned like earthly stars. The Grand Master of the temple was past 60 years of age, his face marked by decades of sun and wind and the weight of command. Beside him knelt a dozen of his brother knights, their voices joined in the ancient prayers that had been sung in this place for more than a century. Pater Noster qui es in Celis, they chanted, the Latin words echoing off stone walls adorned with the carved faces of angels and martyrs. Sanctificator nomen tuum ... The chapel was a thing of beauty that spoke to the glory of God and the devotion of those who served Him. Columns of Parisian limestone rose like forest trees toward a vaulted ceiling, painted with scenes from the life of Christ. Stained glass windows, still dark in the pre-dawn hour, would soon blaze with the light of the rising sun, casting rainbows of blue and gold and crimson across the sacred space. The altar itself was carved from a single block of marble brought from the quarries of Carrara, and upon it rested relics gathered from the Holy Land, fragments of the true cross, earth from Calvary, stones from the tomb of Christ himself. But it was not these sanctified relics that made this place truly sacred to the Templars. Hidden beneath the altar, in vaults that few had ever seen, lay treasures and documents that predated their order, secrets that had been guarded since the fall of Jerusalem, knowledge that could shake the foundations of the Christian world. Damali knew of these things as had his predecessors, and the weight of that knowledge had aged him more than any battlefield wound. "Forgive us our trespasses," the Grand Master prayed, though he could not say whether he asked forgiveness for sins committed or for sins he had failed to prevent. Outside the chapel, Brother Geoffrey de Gonneville moved through the corridors of the temple with the purposeful stride of a man about his appointed duties. As the preceptor of Normandy, he was responsible for the military training of the younger knights, and his scarred hands bore witness to a lifetime spent with sword and mace. Yet this morning something felt different. The very air seemed charged with tension, as if a storm approached, though the sky showed no clouds. The corridors of the temple were built for defense as much as worship, with narrow windows that could serve as archers' ports, and thick wooden doors bound with iron. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The stone floor was worn smooth by the passage of countless feet over the decades, and tapestries depicting the battles of the Crusades hung from the walls like frozen moments of glory and tragedy. As Geoffrey turned a corner, he nearly collided with Brother Aymery de Villers, the temple's treasurer, whose face was pale as fresh parchment. "Brother Geoffrey," Aymery whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled fear, "come quickly. There are men moving in the streets outside, armed men wearing the king's colors." Geoffrey felt ice form in his veins. "How many?" "Too many, too. Count. They surround us like wolves around a wounded stag." The two knights hurried toward the nearest window that looked out over the approaches to the temple. What they saw there made their blood run cold. In the growing light of dawn, they could make out companies of royal soldiers positioned at every street that led to the temple complex. Mail glittered dully in the half-light, and the fleur-de-lis banners of France hung limp in the still air, like harbingers of doom. "We must warn the Grand Master," Geoffrey said, but even as the words left his lips, they heard it, the sound that every warrior dreads above all others, the harsh blast of war horns echoing from the streets around. The temple, followed by the rumble of many feet moving at once, the clatter of armor and weapons, the shouts of officers calling their men to advance. The attack had begun. Captain de Pereils led the main assault against the temple's great gate, a massive portal of oak bound with iron that had stood unconquered for generations. Behind him came his best men, their shields locked together in a wall of wood and steel, their spears gleaming like a forest of deadly thorns. The battering ram they carried was a tree trunk wrapped with iron bands, blessed by the king's chaplain and consecrated to the work of holy justice for France and the king. De Pereils roared, his sword held high above his head. "Let no man escape." The ram struck the gate with a thunderous crash that echoed across the city like the voice of God's wrath. The ancient oak held, but cracks appeared in the wood, and dust fell from the stone arch above. Again the ram struck, and again, each blow accompanied by the rhythmic chanting of the soldiers who swung it. Inside the temple, chaos had erupted as knights and sergeants rushed to arm themselves and man the walls, but they were trapped like rats in a barrel, surrounded on all sides by overwhelming numbers, facing men who had come not to do battle, but to arrest and capture. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was betrayal, cold and calculated and absolute. Jacques de Molay stood in the center of the great hall, still wearing his white robe of worship, his aged face calm despite the tumult around him. Brother knights rushed past him bearing swords and crossbows, their faces grim with the knowledge that they faced not Saracens in honest combat, but fellow Christians, who had come to destroy them. My Lord Grand Master, Geoffrey de Gonneville, appeared at his side, his own sword already in his hand. We must flee. There are passages beneath the temple that lead to the river. Some of us might yet escape. De Molay shook his gray head slowly. No, my son. I am too old to run like a thief in the night. If this is God's will, then I shall meet it with the dignity befitting my office. But the treasures, the documents, everything we have guarded, must not fall into their hands. The Grand Master's eyes were filled with a sadness deeper than the grave. Send word to Brother Montagnec in the lower vaults. Let him gather what he can and flee by the river passage. Some things must survive even if we do not. The great gate finally gave way with a crack like thunder, the ancient oak splintering and falling inward in a rain of splinters and iron nails. Through the breach poured the king's soldiers, their weapons gleaming in the growing light, their faces hard with purpose. Captain de Parales was among the first through the gate, his sword already stained with the blood of Templar sergeants who had tried to hold the breach. What followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. The Templars fought with the desperate courage of cornered lions, but they were vastly outnumbered and taken completely by surprise. Brother knights fell bleeding on the stones where they had knelt in prayer only moments before, their white mantles turned red with their own blood. The few who tried to reach the walls were cut down by crossbow bolts fired from the surrounding streets, their bodies tumbling from the battlements like broken dolls dot in the great hall. Jacques de Molay knelt once more, not in prayer but in surrender, his hands clasped behind his back as royal soldiers bound them with chains of iron. Around him, his surviving brothers were being similarly secured, their faces bearing the stunned expression of men who could not quite believe the magnitude of the betrayal they had witnessed. Jacques de Molay, Captain de Parales announced formally, by order of His Majesty Philip, King of France, you stand accused of heresy, blasphemy, and crimes against God and man. You will be taken from this place and held for trial before the Holy Inquisition. The Grand Master raised his gray eyes to meet those of his captor. I know you, Alain de Parales. Your father served an outrimer under my command. He was a good man and a faithful Christian. As am I, the captain replied, though his voice held no conviction. I serve my king as he served his God. And when your king commands you to deny Christ and worship false idols, will you do that as well in the name of service? De Parales struck him then a backhanded blow that split the old man's lip and sent blood running down his white beard. Speak no more, heretic. You will have your chance to confess when the inquisitors question you. As the Templars were being led away, in chains, other soldiers ransacked the temple complex with systematic thoroughness. They stripped the chapel of its golden altar vessels and sacred relics, pried gems from the walls, and carried away manuscripts and documents by the cartload. The royal treasury would be enriched beyond measure, and the king's debts would be forgiven in the blood of his creditors. But in the deepest vaults beneath the temple, Brother Montanak worked with desperate haste to gather the most precious and dangerous items in the Templars' possession. Ancient scrolls wrapped in silk, chalices carved from wood that had grown in the Garden of Eden, books written in languages that predated the Tower of Babel. These and other treasures were loaded into leather satchels by a handful of knights who had remained behind while their brothers died above. "The passage to the river is clear," reported Brother Arnaud de Toroya, his young face streaked with dirt and sweat. "But we must go now before they discover the entrance." Montanak sealed the last satchel and slung it over his shoulder. The weight of centuries pressed down upon him, the knowledge that he carried items that could rewrite the history of mankind. "What of the others? All taken or dead?" Arnaud replied. "We are the last. The survivors fled through tunnels that had been old when the Templars first claimed the site, passages that led beneath the city streets and emerged near the banks of the Seine. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of destruction as the king's men completed their work of pillage and desecration. As they emerged into the gray light of dawn beside the river, Montanak looked back toward the temple for the last time. Smoke was beginning to rise from the complex, and the screams of the wounded and dying echoed across the water like the cries of the damned. The most powerful military order in Christendom had been destroyed in a single morning, its knights scattered to the winds or dragged away in chains. But some few had escaped, and they carried with them secrets that kings would kill for and popes would die to possess. The Templars were broken, but they were not destroyed. Like seeds scattered by the wind, they would take root in distant places and grow in the shadows, waiting for the day when they might return to claim their rightful place in the world. The long night of exile had begun. 3 days after the fall of the temple, the forests of Fontainebleau whispered with secrets carried on the autumn wind. Ancient oaks stood like silent sentinels in the mist, their gnarled branches reaching toward a sky the color of old pewter, while beneath their canopy, shadows moved with purpose through the undergrowth. Brother Arnaud de Toroya crouched beside a stream that ran black as ink beneath the gray light, listening to sounds that might be pursuit or merely the restless spirits of the woodland. Beside him, Brother Montanak cleaned his sword with methodical care, his weathered face bearing fresh cuts from their desperate flight through the streets of Paris. The leather satchels that contained their precious cargo lay beside him, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from the damp. 3 other Templars completed their small company. Brother Piers, young and eager despite the horror he had witnessed. Brother André, scarred veteran of a dozen battles in Outremer. And Brother Bertrand, the temple's former librarian, whose knowledge of languages and ancient texts made him invaluable to their mission. "The hounds grow closer," Piers whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. Through the mist, they could hear the distant baying of tracking dogs and the crash of armed men moving through the forest without regard for stealth. "Let them come," Andre muttered, his dark eyes hard as flint. "I'd rather die with steel in my hand than rot in the king's dungeons." Montanak shook his head. "We cannot fight them all, my brothers. Our duty is not to die gloriously, but to preserve what we carry until it can be delivered to those who will continue our work. The satchels beside him seemed to pulse with hidden power, as if the ancient artifacts within were aware of the danger that surrounded them. Manuscripts written in Aramaic and Greek, chalices carved from stone that had been blessed by Christ himself, scrolls that spoke of bloodlines and prophecies that could shake the very foundations of the church. These treasures had been gathered over 2 centuries of careful searching and deadly sacrifice. "Where do we go?" Bertrand asked, his scholarly face pale with exhaustion. The librarian was not accustomed to flight through wilderness, and his soft hands were already blistered from their desperate journey. "North," Montanhac replied, "to the old sanctuary at Provence. The brothers there have prepared for this day, and they have ways of moving our cargo beyond the reach of royal agents." The sound of horns echoed through the forest, closer now, accompanied by the crash of men and horses moving at speed through the undergrowth. Captain de Parales had been given fresh orders from the king himself: find the escaped Templars and recover whatever they had taken from the vaults, for Philip suspected that the most dangerous treasures had slipped through his net. "Move," Montanhac commanded, shouldering one of the precious satchels. "Stay low and keep silent. If we are separated, make for the ruins of the old Roman temple, 3 leagues north of here. We'll regroup there at nightfall." The 5 knights moved through the forest like ghosts, their white mantles abandoned for the brown robes of common monks, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods that cast their features in shadow. They had learned the arts of stealth and concealment during their years in the Holy Land, where survival often depended on moving unseen through hostile territory. Behind them, the forest erupted with the sounds of pursuit. Royal soldiers crashed through the undergrowth like wild boars, their mail and weapons making enough noise to wake the dead. Dogs bayed and howled as they followed the scent trail, while mounted knights called out coordinates and directions to their infantry. It was a hunt in the truest sense, with the Templars as the quarry and the king's men as the hunters. Brother Piers stumbled over a fallen log and went sprawling in the wet leaves, his satchel flying from his grasp to land with a splash in a muddy hollow. As he scrambled to retrieve it, the sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the excited baying of hounds that had caught fresh scent. "Leave me," Piers whispered as Montanhac helped him to his feet. "I'll hold them here while you escape with the cargo." "We leave no man behind," Montanhac replied firmly, though his eyes showed the strain of their desperate situation. "That was never our way." They pressed deeper into the forest, following game trails and stream beds that would confuse the dogs, moving always northward toward the sanctuary that might offer them temporary respite. The mist grew thicker as the day wore on, providing welcome concealment but also making navigation treacherous. More than once they found themselves turned around, following paths that led in circles or ended at impassable ravines. It was Andre who spotted the horsemen. First, a patrol of royal knights moving at a walk through a clearing ahead, their lance points gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. The Templars froze like deer, hardly daring to breathe as the enemy passed within a spear's length of their hiding place. One of the horses whickered and tossed its head, as if sensing their presence, but its rider merely spurred it forward without investigation. When the patrol had passed, Montanhac led his men in a wide circle around the clearing, adding precious time to their journey but avoiding what would have been certain discovery. They could not afford a fight, not with what they carried, not with the future of their order hanging in the balanced dot as evening approached. They finally reached the ruins that had once been a temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, built by Roman legions when the forest was young and the gods of Rome held sway over Gaul. Little remained now but tumbled stones and broken columns, overgrown with moss and ivy, home to nothing but owls and bats, and the memories of ancient prayers. Yet to the Templars, it was a sanctuary blessed by age and forgotten by the world. They sheltered in what had once been the inner sanctum, where a statue of the King of Gods had stood in majesty. Now only the base remained, cracked and worn by centuries of weather, but Montanhek knelt beside it as reverently as he would have approached a Christian altar. In the gathering dusk, he opened one of the satchels and withdrew an object wrapped in silk, so fine it seemed to glow with inner light. "Gather close, my brothers," he commanded softly. "There are things you must know before we go further, secrets that have been kept even from most of our order." The 4 knights formed a circle around their leader, their faces grave in the dying light. Somewhere in the distance they could still hear the sounds of pursuit, but for this moment they were safe in their ancient refuge. Montanhek unwrapped the silk to reveal a chalice unlike anything they had ever seen. It was carved from a single piece of wood so dark it seemed to absorb light, and around its rim were inscribed symbols that predated any known alphabet. The cup itself was stained with something that might have been wine or might have been blood, and merely looking upon it filled the knights with a sense of awe and terror. "This," Montanhek whispered, "is the cup from which our Lord drank at the Last Supper. It was hidden in Jerusalem for centuries after the crucifixion, guarded by a secret brotherhood that claimed direct descent from the apostles themselves. When the city fell to the Saracens, it was brought to us for safekeeping." Brother Bertrand leaned closer, his scholarly mind racing. The Grail of legend? But surely such a thing is nothing more than poetry and romance. Romance? Montanhek's voice held a note of bitter laughter. Would men die for romance, brother? Would kings hunt us through the forests like wild animals for the sake of a poet's fancy? He gestured to the other satchels. What we carry here is more dangerous than any army, more powerful than any weapon of war. We are the guardians of truth itself, and truth is the one thing that neither kings nor popes can afford to have revealed. He rewrapped the chalice carefully and secured it once more in its satchel. Around them the ruins seemed to echo with whispers from the past, as if the ancient stones remembered other nights when desperate men had sought sanctuary in this place. "What truth?" asked Andre, his scarred face intent in the shadows. Montanhek was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the visible world. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "The bloodline, brother. The sacred bloodline that connects our Lord to the present day. There were descendants, children born of his marriage to the Magdalene, and their offspring live still in hidden places throughout Christendom." The silence that followed was broken only by the rustle of wind through dead leaves and the distant cry of a night bird. The implications of what their leader had revealed struck each man like a physical blow, for if such things were true, then the very foundations of their faith would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. "Impossible," breathed Piers. "Our Lord was divine, without sin, without the needs of mortal flesh." "Divine, yes," Montanhek agreed, but also human, as the Church itself teaches. And if he was truly human, then why not husband and father, as well as teacher and savior? He touched the satchel that contained the chalice. The truth has been hidden for 3 centuries, known only to the highest initiates of our order. We were its guardians, its protectors, and now we are all that stands between that truth and its destruction. Brother Andre spat into the darkness. So the king destroys us not for our gold, but for our knowledge? He fears what we know more than what we possess. Gold can be replaced, Montanak replied, but truth, once lost, can never be recovered. The sound of horses approaching through the forest brought their council to an abrupt end. The pursuit had found their trail once more, and soon this ancient sanctuary would be crawling with the king's soldiers. The Templars gathered their precious cargo and prepared to resume their flight through the darkness dot as they slipped away into the night, leaving only cold stones and empty shadows behind. Brother Montanhak allowed himself one last look at the ruins of the Roman temple. So many civilizations had risen and fallen in this place, so many gods had been worshipped and forgotten, yet the truth they carried transcended them all. Whatever came next, whether capture or escape, death or exile, that truth would endure. 5 knights vanished into the forest darkness like wraiths, their footsteps swallowed by the soft carpet of fallen leaves. Behind them, torchlight flickered between the trees as the king's hunters drew ever closer, their voices calling out coordinates and commands that echoed through the ancient woods like the cries of hunting demons. But ahead lay only uncertainty, the treacherous path to Provence, where allies waited in the shadows, and beyond that, an exile that might last generations. The Templars had fallen, but from their ashes would rise something darker, more dangerous, and infinitely more patient. Shadow Knights had been born. The monastery of Saint Jacques de Provence stood like a fortress against the star-scattered darkness, its limestone walls bleached bone-white by centuries of wind and rain. Within its cloistered gardens, where autumn had painted the leaves in shades of blood and gold, 5 shadows moved with practiced stealth toward a door that bore no markings save for 3 small scratches in the stone, the sign known only to those who had sworn the deepest oaths of the temple. Brother Montanhak pressed his palm against the cold stone, feeling for the hidden mechanism that would grant them entry. Behind him, his 4 companions waited in tense silence, their precious cargo clutched against their chests like mothers protecting newborn children. 3 weeks had passed since the fall of Paris, 3 weeks of flight through forests and across, rivers of sleeping in ruins and eating whatever they could forage or steal. Their beards had grown wild, their robes were torn and stained, and their eyes held the hollow look of men who had witnessed the end of their world. The door opened with barely a whisper of sound, revealing a corridor lit by a single candle that cast dancing shadows on walls carved with symbols that predated Christianity. Brother Guillaume de Beauseuil emerged from the darkness like a specter, his gaunt face bearing the marks of sleepless nights and terrible knowledge. As the preceptor of Champagne, he had received word of the temple's fall through a network of signals that stretched across Europe like an invisible web. "You are late," Guillaume whispered, his voice barely audible in the confined space. "We feared you had been taken with the others." "We nearly were," Montanak replied, embracing his old comrade with the fierce grip of brotherhood. The king's hounds follow every trail, and his gold buys information from those who should be our allies. Guillaume's eyes fell upon the leather satchels that Arnaud and Andre carried, and his weathered face grew pale as parchment. You have them? The sacred relics? All that could be saved, Montanac confirmed. But we are the last. Paris is lost, and with it 9/10 of our order. Jacques de Molay rots in the king's dungeons, and our brothers await the Inquisitor's fire. The preceptor crossed himself and muttered a prayer for the dead and dying, then gestured for them to follow him deeper into the monastery's hidden depths. They descended stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use, passing through chambers where the walls bore frescoes depicting scenes from the Gospels alongside symbols that told older, stranger stories. The air grew thick with the scent of incense and ancient parchment, and somewhere in the darkness ahead they could hear the soft murmur of voices chanting in languages that Rome had tried to forget. The chamber they entered was circular, its domed ceiling painted with a star map that showed the heavens as they had appeared on the night of Christ's birth. Around the walls stood 9 men in the white robes of Templar knights, their faces hidden by deep hoods that cast their features in shadow. At the center of the room stood an altar carved from black stone, and upon it lay an open book whose pages seemed to glow with their own inner light. "Brothers," Guillaume announced formally, "I present to you the survivors of the Paris Temple, Montanac, Arnaud, Andre, Piers, and Bertrand. They have preserved the sacred trust through fire and sword, and they carry with them the hope of our order's future." One by one, the hooded figures stepped forward to embrace the newcomers, speaking passwords and signs that confirmed their identity and their loyalty. These were the hidden ones, Templars who had lived in shadow even before the Purge began, men whose very existence was known only to the highest initiates of the order. They had prepared for this day, establishing safe houses and secret routes, gathering resources and allies who would help the survivors disappear into legend. Brother Etienne de Troyes, the monastery's librarian of hidden knowledge, approached Montanac with hands that trembled with anticipation. "The Grail?" he whispered. "You have brought the Grail?" Montanac nodded and carefully withdrew the wooden chalice from its protective wrapping. Even in the subdued light of the chamber, the ancient cup seemed to pulse with power, its dark wood gleaming like polished jet, its rim inscribed with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. The assembled knights fell to their knees as one, their voices joining in a chant that echoed from the stone walls. Sangrail, sanguis regalis, blood royal, sacred line. From the cup of the Last Supper to the present day, the bloodline endures. The truth survives, in darkness and in light, forever and always. Etienne received the chalice with hands that shook like autumn leaves, carrying it to a niche in the wall where other relics waited in silent splendor. The crown of thorns fragments glittered like captured starlight. Earth from the Garden of Gethsemane lay in crystal vials, and scrolls written in the hand of apostles themselves rested in cases of ivory and gold. "And the genealogies?" Etienne asked, his scholarly mind already racing ahead to the implications of what they possessed. "The bloodline records?" Bertrand stepped forward, his librarian's instincts making him the natural keeper of such documents. From his satchel he withdrew a collection of scrolls and codices that had been hidden in the deepest vaults beneath the Paris temple. Complete lineages from the time of our Lord to the present day, he confirmed. Names, locations, and proofs that would shake the very foundations of the church if they were ever revealed. The assembled knights murmured prayers and curses in equal measure, for they all understood the terrible responsibility that now rested upon their shoulders. Knowledge that could topple kingdoms and destroy the power of Rome, bloodlines that connected Christ himself to living descendants who walked among them still. These secrets had been guarded for 3 centuries, and now they were all that remained of the temple's sacred mission. Guillaume de Beaujeu raised his hand for silence, and when the chamber was still as a tomb, he spoke in the formal tones reserved for the most solemn occasions. Brothers, the temple as we knew it is dead. Our Grand Master is chained, our knights are scattered, our properties seized by those who call us heretics and blasphemers. But the true temple, the temple of the Spirit, the guardians of the sacred trust, that temple lives on in us. He moved to the altar and placed his hand upon the ancient book that lay open there, its pages covered with text in a dozen languages and scripts. Tonight we take new oaths, swear new allegiances, and accept new names. We become the Shadow Knights, the hidden guardians, the keepers of the sacred fire. We will go forth into the world as merchants and scholars, as priests and nobles, but always we will remember our true purpose. One by one the knights approached the altar to swear their secret oaths. They renounced their old names and accepted new identities that would allow them to move through the world without detection. Montanhac became Marcus the Merchant. Arnaud transformed into Anton the Scribe. André took the name Albert the Pilgrim. Each man received a signet ring bearing symbols that would identify him to other survivors, and a cipher that would allow him to communicate with a network that was even now spreading across Europe. You will scatter to the 4 winds, Guillaume commanded. Some will go north to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce offers sanctuary to those who oppose the French king. Others will journey south to Spain, where our brothers in Calatrava and Santiago still hold influence. Still others will travel east to the lands of the German princes, or west to the ports where ships sail to unknown shores. He gestured to a table where maps and documents lay spread like the plans of war. But wherever you go, whatever names you take, remember this: we are the guardians of truth itself. The bloodline must be protected, the sacred relics must be preserved, and the knowledge we carry must be passed down through the generations until the day comes when it can be revealed without bringing destruction upon the world. Young Piers raised his hand like a student seeking permission to speak. Master, how will we know when that day has come? How will we recognize the time for revelation? Wilhelm's eyes grew distant, as if he could see through the veil of years. To come, there will be signs, brother. When kings no longer rule by divine right, when the church's power begins to wane, when men seek knowledge for its own sake rather than for the glory of earthly power, then the time will be ripe. Until then we wait, and we watch, and we guard our precious cargo against those who would destroy it. The ceremony continued through the night, as each knight received his new identity and his assigned mission. Sacred relics were divided among them, with the most precious items going to those who would establish the most secure sanctuaries. The Grail itself would journey to a castle in the Scottish Highlands, while the genealogies would be hidden in a monastery in the mountains of Catalonia. Maps were memorized and then burned. Codes were learned by heart and the written versions destroyed. As dawn approached, bringing with it the need for final farewells, Brother Etienne approached Montaignac with a final gift. It was a small brass key, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the candlelight. "This opens a vault beneath the Cathedral of St. Denis," Etienne explained. "Should the worst befall us all, should every other hiding place be discovered and every other guardian slain, there you will find the final secret, the location of the tomb itself." Montagnac's blood ran cold. "The tomb, you mean?" "The burial place of the Magdalene," Etienne confirmed. "And with her proof that cannot be denied, cannot be dismissed as forgery or fraud. The physical evidence of the sacred marriage, the divine bloodline, the truth that would remake the world." The key felt heavy as lead in Montagnac's palm, weighted. With centuries of secret knowledge and desperate hope, he slipped it into a hidden pocket sewn into his robes, next to his heart where it would rest for whatever time remained to him. As the first light of morning began to filter through the chamber's narrow windows, the Shadow Knights prepared to scatter to their appointed destinations. They embraced like brothers who might never meet again, speaking words of encouragement and farewell that would echo in their memories for years to come. Guillaume de Beaujeu stood at the chamber's entrance. As each man departed, giving final instructions and blessings. To Montagnac, now Marcus the merchant, he spoke words that would haunt his dreams. "Remember, brother, we are no longer knights errant, seeking glory in battle. We are seeds planted in darkness, waiting for the spring that may not come for centuries. Guard your portion of the truth well, and pray that those who come after us will prove worthy of the trust we place in them." As the sun rose over Provence, casting long shadows across the monastery's peaceful gardens, the last remnants of the Knights Templar melted away into legend. But the truth they carried would endure, hidden in secret places, guarded by men whose names would be forgotten, but whose purpose would never die. The Shadow Knights had begun their long vigil. Dr. Sarah Chun pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and leaned closer to the medieval manuscript that lay open beneath the pool of amber light cast by her desk lamp. The Bodleian Library's basement archive felt like a tomb at this hour, the silence broken only by the soft hum of climate control systems and the distant rumble of late-night traffic on the high street above. At 34, Sarah had already earned a reputation as one of Oxford's most promising medievalists, but what she was looking at now threatened to overshadow everything she had accomplished in her career. The manuscript was bound in leather sew. Old, it seemed ready to crumble at a touch, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with the kind of stains that spoke of centuries, hidden in damp cellars and forgotten archives. It had arrived that morning as part of a collection donated by the estate of Lord Pemberton, a reclusive antiquarian who had spent his fortune acquiring medieval curiosities from across Europe. Most of the collection had been standard fare, illuminated psalters, treatises on medicine and astronomy, the usual detritus of monastic libraries broken up during the Reformation. But this manuscript was different. The text was written in a mixture of Latin and medieval French, but it was the marginalia that had caught Sarah's attention. Notes scribbled in what appeared to be a cipher, accompanied by symbols that made her heart race with excitement. She had seen those symbols before in her research on the Knights Templar, though never in such profusion or in such a clearly systematic arrangement. "Deus Vult," she whispered, reading the opening line of the text. "God wills it." The battle cry of the Crusades, but here it seemed to introduce something far more complex than a mere chronicle of military campaigns. Sarah's laptop hummed quietly beside the ancient manuscript, its screen displaying dozens of open tabs and research windows. She had been working for 6 hours straight, cross-referencing symbols, analyzing linguistic patterns, and slowly beginning to decode what appeared to be a survival guide written for Templars fleeing persecution. The deeper she delved into the text, the more convinced she became that she was looking at something extraordinary, a first-hand account of the events following the arrest of the Templars in 1307. Her phone buzzed with a text message, the blue glow startling in the amber-lit darkness of the archive. It was from Marcus Thorne, her research partner at Cambridge, who specialized in medieval cryptography. His message was characteristically brief. "Found something interesting. Can you video call?" Sarah glanced around the empty archive, then activated her laptop's camera. Marcus appeared on screen moments later, his angular face illuminated by the harsh white light of his own office. Even at this late hour, his dark hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive shirt showed no signs of the long day they had both endured. "Sarah," he began without preamble, "you need to see this. I've been analyzing those cipher fragments you sent me this afternoon, and I think I've cracked the basic substitution pattern." "Already?" Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and professional jealousy. Marcus had a gift for cryptanalysis that bordered on the supernatural, but she had hoped to make more progress on her own before seeking his help. "It's not as complex as it first appeared," Marcus explained, his fingers dancing across his keyboard. "The cipher is based on a modified Atbash pattern, but with additional layers that reference astronomical positions. Very sophisticated for the period, but not impossible to decode once you understand the underlying logic." Sarah watched as Marcus shared his screen, displaying a document covered with symbols and their proposed translations. "According to my analysis, this section here references a sacred brotherhood that survived the great betrayal of the Iron King, presumably Philip IV of France. But more interesting is this passage that mentions guardians of the royal blood and keepers of the sacred cup." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Marcus, I think we're looking at more than just historical documents here. The manuscript I'm working with contains detailed instructions for preserving and hiding relics, including references to bloodline genealogies and sacred artifacts." "Bloodline genealogies?" Marcus leaned closer to his camera, his dark eyes intense. "Sarah, you realize what this could mean? If these documents are authentic, if they really describe Templar survival after 1307, they could rewrite the entire narrative of medieval history," Sarah finished. "The official story is that the Templars were disbanded, their leaders executed, their wealth confiscated. But if some survived, if they established secret networks..." A soft sound from somewhere in the archive made Sarah freeze. It was barely audible, the whisper of footsteps on stone, the quiet settling of an old building, or perhaps something more sinister. She muted her microphone and listened intently, but heard only silence. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice came through her speakers, tinny and concerned. Are you there? She unmuted herself and forced her voice to remain calm. I'm here. Just thought I heard something. I'm here. Something. Listen, Marcus. I think we need to be careful about how we proceed with this research. If these documents are as significant as we think, there will be others who want them, Marcus agreed. Collectors, scholars, religious organizations. Hell, if the bloodline references are what they appear to be, this could attract attention from some very powerful and very private groups. Sarah nodded, though part of her wondered if Marcus was being paranoid. Then again, she had heard stories about medieval manuscripts disappearing from libraries, about scholars who had stumbled onto controversial discoveries only to find their research mysteriously defunded or their access to materials revoked. The academic world could be ruthless when it came to protecting established narratives. I want to document everything before we go public, Sarah said. High-resolution photographs, transcriptions, provenance research. If someone tries to make these documents disappear, I want to have complete records. Good thinking, Marcus replied. I'll continue working on the cipher analysis from my end. But Sarah, be careful who you talk to about this. Until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with, it might be wise to keep this between us. After ending the call, Sarah returned the manuscript with renewed intensity. She photographed each page carefully, making note of every symbol, every marginalia annotation, every stain or mark that might provide clues to the document's history. The text itself was becoming clearer as she worked, revealing a narrative that was both fantastic and strangely convincing. According to the manuscript, a group of Templar Knights had indeed survived the Purge of 1307, escaping with sacred relics and secret knowledge that included genealogical records tracing the bloodline of Christ through the centuries. These survivors had established a hidden network across Europe, taking new names and identities while secretly working to preserve their sacred trust. The manuscript contained detailed instructions for encoding messages, establishing safe houses, and identifying fellow survivors through a complex system of signs and symbols. But it was the final section of the manuscript that made Sarah's hands tremble as she turned the ancient pages. Written in a different hand, apparently added years or even decades after the original text, it contained what appeared to be a map, not of territories or cities, but of bloodlines and their modern descendants. Names and locations scattered across Europe and beyond, connected by lines that suggested family relationships stretching from medieval times to the present-day dot at the bottom of the page, and letters that seemed to burn with their own dark fire. Was written a single word in Latin, custodes. Guardians. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. If the manuscript was authentic and every test she could think of suggested that it was, then she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that had lasted for more than 7 centuries. Somewhere in the world, descendants of the original Shadow Knights might still be carrying out their ancient mission, guarding secrets that could shake the foundations of Christianity itself. She glanced at her watch and was startled to see that it was nearly 3 in the morning. The archive felt different at this hour, filled with shadows that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Every small sound made her heart race. The settling of old wood, the whisper of air through ventilation ducts, the distant rumble of a late-night delivery truck dot as she prepared to photograph the final pages of the manuscript. Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, in the margin beside the word Custodies, someone had drawn a small symbol in what appeared to be fresh ink. 3 dots arranged in a triangle, the same mark that appeared throughout the medieval text as a sign of authenticity. Someone else knew about the manuscript. Someone who had access to the archive, who understood the significance of the ancient symbols, and who wanted her to know that she was being watched. Sarah's hands shook as she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the archive. The manuscript would have to remain in the library's secure storage, but she had photographed every page, captured every detail that might be important for her research. As she packed her laptop and notes, she tried to convince herself that the fresh symbol was just her imagination, a trick of tired eyes and dim lighting. But as she made her way through the silent corridors toward the exit, she could not shake the feeling that she was no longer alone in her research. Someone else was interested in the Shadow Knights, and that someone had resources and access that suggested they were far more than casual academic competitors. The game, as they said, was afoot. Cambridge University, September 18, 2024. The morning fog clung to the River Cam like the breath of ghosts, muffling the sounds of early joggers and cycling students as Dr. Marcus Thorne made his way across the ancient bridges toward his office. In the Faculty of Medieval Studies, 3 days had passed since his video call with Sarah, 3 days during which he had thrown himself into decoding the Templar cipher with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The breakthrough had come at 2 in the morning, when the pattern finally revealed itself like a puzzle box, suddenly clicking open. Marcus's office occupied the top floor of a medieval tower that had once been part of a monastery, its stone walls, thick enough to keep out both winter cold and modern distractions. Tall windows looked out over the college courtyards where scholars had walked for 8 centuries, their footsteps wearing smooth paths in the ancient stone. But this morning, as Marcus climbed the narrow spiral staircase to his domain, he felt eyes upon him, a prickling sensation between his shoulder blades that spoke of watchers in the shadows. He paused at the first landing, pretending to check his phone while listening for sounds of pursuit. The stairwell was empty save for the morning light filtering through arrow-slit windows, but the feeling persisted. Someone was taking an interest in his research, and Marcus had learned long ago to trust his instincts when it came to academic politics and professional rivalry. His office was exactly as he had left it the night before computer screens still, glowing with cipher analysis software, reference books stacked in precarious towers, and the walls covered with printouts of medieval symbols arranged in patterns that would have looked like madness to an outsider. But Marcus's trained eye immediately noticed subtle signs of disturbance. Papers shifted slightly out of alignment. A book opened to a different page, dust patterns on his desk that suggested someone had moved his laptop while he was away. Interesting. Reading material, came a voice from the corner of the room. Marcus spun around to find a woman sitting in his reading chair, her presence so unobtrusive that he might have missed her entirely if she hadn't spoken. She appeared to be in her 40s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and clothes that suggested professional competence without calling attention to themselves. Her accent was cultured, but difficult to place, perhaps European. but with the kind of international polish that came from years of diplomatic or academic travel. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Marcus said, his hand moving instinctively toward the phone on his desk. "And I'm quite certain I locked my office when I left last night." The woman smiled, an expression that held no warmth despite its perfect symmetry. "Dr. Thorne, please don't be alarmed. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I represent certain interested parties who have been following your recent research with great attention." "What research would that be?" Marcus asked carefully, though his eyes flickered toward the computer screens where fragments of decoded Templar cipher were still visible. "Come now, Doctor. There's no need for pretense between professionals." Elena rose from the chair with fluid grace, moving to examine one of the symbol charts on the wall. "Your work on medieval cryptography is quite renowned in certain circles, particularly your recent analysis of 14th century cipher systems." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. The Templar research was supposed to be confidential, known only to himself and Sarah, yet this woman seemed intimately familiar with their discoveries, speaking with the casual authority of someone who had been monitoring their every move. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Marcus said, though he knew the denial sounded weak even to his own ears. "My current research focuses on trade guild communications in medieval England. Nothing particularly controversial or sensitive." Elena turned to face him, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of knowledge accumulated over decades. "Dr. Thorne, let me be direct. We know about the manuscripts discovered in the Pemberton collection. We know about your collaboration with Dr. Chun at Oxford. And we know that you have made significant progress in decoding communications that were never intended for modern eyes." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus found himself backed against his own desk, trapped between this mysterious woman and the evidence of his research that surrounded them both. "Who exactly are we?" he managed to ask. "An organization with a very long history and a very specific interest in preserving certain historical narratives," Elena replied. "Let's simply say that we have been watching over these materials for far longer than the academic community has been aware of their existence." She moved to Marcus's computer and, with movements that spoke of intimate familiarity with his security systems, accessed files that should have been password protected. On the screen appeared his most recent cipher analysis, pages of decoded text that revealed the hidden communications network of the surviving Templars. "Impressive work," Elena commented, scrolling through the translations with the casual interest of someone reviewing a grocery list. "Though I'm afraid you've only scratched the surface of what these documents contain. The medieval cipher you've been working with is merely the outer layer of a much deeper puzzle." Marcus's academic curiosity warred with a growing sense of danger. "What do you mean, outer layer?" Elena smiled again, and this time there was something almost predatory in the expression. The Templars were far more sophisticated than most historians realize. They didn't simply create a single cipher system. They created layers within layers, wheels within wheels. What you've decoded so far is essentially medieval gossip, communications about safe houses and travel routes. The real secrets lie much deeper. She turned away from the computer to face him directly. "Dr. Thorne, my organization is prepared to offer you something that few scholars ever receive, access to the complete archive. Original documents, authenticated relics, genealogical records that trace bloodlines back to the first century of the Common Era. Treasures that would make your current discovery seem like a footnote in comparison. In exchange for what? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Discretion, Elena replied simply. Your research would continue, but under our guidance and within our parameters. Your findings would be published in appropriate venues, but with certain editorial considerations to ensure that sensitive information remains protected. Marcus felt the weight of the offer like a physical thing pressing down upon his shoulders. Access to materials that no other scholar had seen, the chance to make discoveries that would define his career, all of it within reach, requiring only that he abandon his independence and submit to the control of this mysterious organization. And if I refuse? He asked. Elena's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Dr. Thorne, you're an intelligent man. I'm sure you can imagine the various ways that an academic career might become complicated when certain irregularities come to light. Questions about research methodology, concerns about authentication procedures, allegations of academic misconduct that seem to follow a scholar from institution to institution. The threat was delivered with the calm precision of a surgeon making an incision, all the more effective for its understated delivery. Marcus had seen careers destroyed by whisper campaigns and bureaucratic investigations, brilliant scholars reduced to teaching community college courses because their reputation had been systematically dismantled. I need time to consider your offer, Marcus said, stalling while his mind raced through options and possibilities. Of course, Elena agreed graciously. Though I should mention that Dr. Chung received a similar visit this morning from one of my colleagues. I do hope you'll coordinate your responses. It would be unfortunate if your research partnership were to develop perspectives on how to proceed. The implied threat to Sarah made Marcus's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. How do I contact you when I've made my decision? Elena moved toward the door, with the same fluid grace she had displayed throughout their conversation. No need, Dr. Thorne. We'll be in touch very soon. In the meantime, I suggest you review your recent research with fresh eyes. You might be surprised by what you discover when you know what to look for. She paused at the threshold, turning back, with one final observation. The Templars were destroyed because they forgot a fundamental truth. Knowledge without power is merely curiosity, but knowledge with the wrong kind of power can be fatal. I do hope you'll remember that as you continue your work. When she was gone, Marcus immediately reached for his phone to call Sarah, but stopped when he noticed that his computer screen was displaying a new file, one that hadn't been there moments before. The document appeared to be a fragment of the same medieval cipher they had been working on, but the symbols were arranged in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. As he stared at the screen, the symbols seemed to shift and move, forming new patterns that suggested meanings just beyond the edge of comprehension. At the bottom of the document, written in the same medieval script, but somehow freshly rendered, was a single line of text that made his blood run cold. The Watchers have always watched the Watchers. The game is older than you know. Marcus's hands shook as he reached for his phone. Sarah needed to know what they were dealing with. needed to understand that their academic research had somehow attracted the attention of people who played by rules that existed outside the normal boundaries of scholarly competition. But as he dialed her number, a new fear crept into his mind. If Elena Vasquez and her organization had been monitoring their research so closely, if they had access to secure files in university buildings, then they almost certainly had the ability to monitor phone calls and electronic communications as well. For the first time in his academic career, Marcus Thorne found himself longing for the simple certainties of medieval scholarship, a time when the greatest danger a researcher faced was eye strain from reading ancient manuscripts by candlelight. The modern world, it seemed, held its own varieties of inquisition, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Outside his office window, the fog was beginning to lift from the River Cam, revealing the ancient stones of Cambridge in the pale morning light. But Marcus could not shake the feeling that the shadows were growing deeper, and that somewhere in those shadows, eyes were watching, calculating, and preparing for the next move in a game that had been playing out for 7 centuries. The shadow. Knights, it seemed, were not the only ones who had survived the passing of ages. Their enemies, too, had learned the arts of patience and concealment, and the battle for control of humanity's deepest secrets was about to enter a new and dangerous phase, the Shadow Knights Templar survival after the Purge. St. Denis Cathedral, France, October 13th, 1320. 13 years to the day after the fall of the temple, Brother Montanhuc, now known to the world as Marcus the Merchant, knelt in the shadow of the great cathedral of St. Denis, his weathered hands pressed against cold stone that had witnessed the burial of kings. The brass key that Brother Etienne had given him so many years ago hung heavy around his neck, hidden beneath the simple robes of a traveling trader. Around him, pilgrims and penitents moved through the sacred space like ghosts, their prayers rising toward the soaring vaults where colored light fell and jeweled patterns through windows that told the stories of saints and martyrs. But Montanhuc had not come to pray for the dead kings who lay in their marble tombs beneath the cathedral floor. He had come to fulfill a promise made in darkness, to secure the final secret in a place where even the agents of Philip the Fair would not dare to trespass. The weight of the years pressed down upon him, years of hiding, of false names and careful movements through a Europe that had grown hostile to those who carried the memory of the temple. The entrance to the Forbidden's vault lay behind the tomb of St. Denis himself, concealed by a stone panel that bore no distinguishing marks, save for 3 small dots arranged in a triangle, the ancient sign that had guided him through 13 years of exile. Montanhuc waited until the evening prayers had emptied the cathedral of all but the most dedicated worshippers, then made his way through shadows that seemed to welcome him like old friends. The brass key turned in a lock that had waited centuries for this moment, opening onto stairs that descended into darkness older than the cathedral above. By the light of a single candle, Montanhuc descended into a chamber that predated Christian France, where Druid priests had once conducted rites that Rome had tried to forget. The walls were carved with symbols that told stories in languages that had no names, and the air carried the scent of ages, dust and stone, and the lingering traces of incense burned by hands long since returned to earth. At the center of the chamber stood a stone sarcophagus, its surface worn smooth by time but still bearing inscriptions in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic. Montanhack approached it with the reverence due to the holiest of relics, for within this ancient tomb lay the earthly remains of Mary Magdalene, and with her, proof of the sacred bloodline that connected the divine to the mortal world. Maria Magdalena, he whispered, reading the inscription by candlelight, Uxor Domini Nostri, wife of our Lord, the words that no pope would dare to speak aloud, the truth that had been hidden for 3 centuries behind walls of doctrine and dogma. Montanhack opened the leather satchel he carried and withdrew the genealogical records that he and his fellow survivors had guarded through years of persecution. Carefully, reverently, he placed them beside the sarcophagus where they would rest until the world was ready to receive the truth they contained. As he prepared to seal the chamber once more, Montanhack heard footsteps on the stone stairs above, measured, purposeful steps that spoke of men who knew exactly where they were going. His hand moved instinctively to the dagger at his belt, though he knew that if he had been followed to this sacred place, all his years of caution had been for naught. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden by deep hoods, but their movements marking them as warriors despite their monastic robes. The leader pushed back his hood to reveal features that Montanhack recognized with a shock of recognition and betrayal. Guillaume de Nogret, Montanhack breathed, naming the man who had been King Philip's chief architect of the temple's destruction. I thought you dead these 7 years past. The former minister smiled with the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, dear brother Marcus. Did you truly think that the king's reach did not extend beyond his own grave? Did you imagine that we would simply forget about the treasures that escaped our net 13 years ago? Behind Nogret, his companions moved to block the chamber's only exit, their hands resting casually on weapons that glinted in the candlelight. These were not mere soldiers, but members of a brotherhood that had outlived both king and kingdom, men who served an agenda that transcended mortal politics. The genealogies, Nogret commanded, extending his hand with the casual authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience. The bloodline records that you and your fellow heretics have guarded so carefully. Hand them over, and your death will be swift. Montanhack's laugh echoed off the ancient walls, filled with the bitter mirth of a man who had lived long enough to see the futility of earthly ambition. You think this is about death, Guillaume? You think the threat of mortality matters to one who has spent 13 years already among the living dead? He gestured toward the sarcophagus with its precious cargo of truth. Too late, minister. The seeds have been planted, the network established. Even if you kill every surviving Templar, even if you burn every document and break every stone, the bloodline endures. The descendants live, and they carry the truth in their very veins. Nogret's face darkened with rage, but before he could respond, new voices echoed from the stairs above, the sounds of armed men moving with military precision. The cathedral's peace was shattered by the clash of steel on steel, the shouts of battle, and the screams of the wounded and dying. The Scottish Knights, Montanhack whispered, hope lighting his eyes for the first time in years. Robert the Bruce's men, come to honor the alliance forged in exile. The battle in the chamber above was brief but vicious, as 2 groups of warriors, who had trained for this moment since childhood, met in deadly combat. When silence finally returned to the ancient stones, It was broken by the sound of footsteps descending the stairs, but these moved with the measured tread of allies rather than enemies. Sir James Douglas emerged from the darkness, his sword still dripping with the blood of Nograt's men. The Scottish knight had aged in the years since the fall of the temple, his dark hair now streaked with silver, and his face bearing the scars of a dozen battles. But his eyes still held the fire of a man who served a cause greater than himself. Brother Montanak, Douglas said formally, offering a bow that acknowledged both warrior and priest. The Bruce sends his greetings and his protection. The ship waits at Calais to carry you to safety in Scotland, where your knowledge will be preserved and honored. Montanak looked down at the sarcophagus, where the greatest secret in Christendom lay hidden in darkness. The tomb must remain sealed until the world is ready to receive its truth. But the bloodline records... He hesitated, torn between the safety of exile and the sacred duty that had sustained him through 13 years of hiding. The records stay here, he decided finally, hidden in this holy place until the time comes for revelation. But there are other treasures, other proofs that must be preserved. He turned to Douglas with eyes that burned with prophetic fire. Tell your king that the Shadow Knights accept his protection, but we bring with us obligations that may prove more dangerous than any earthly enemy. Douglas nodded grimly. The Bruce understands the weight of sacred oaths, brother. Scotland will provide sanctuary for as long as the bloodline requires protection. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Montanak took one last look at the sarcophagus, where Mary Magdalene lay in eternal rest. Somewhere in the world above, her descendants walked unknowing among ordinary mortals, carrying in their blood the divine heritage that would one day transform humanity's understanding of itself. The Shadow Knights had done their work, planting seeds that would grow in darkness until the time came for light. Behind them, the chamber sealed itself with the finality of a tomb, its secrets safe for centuries yet to come. Present day, September 20th, 2024. Dr. Sarah Chun's hands trembled as she ended the encrypted video call with Marcus, her laptop screen now dark in the dim light of her Oxford flat. The conversation had confirmed her worst fears. They were being watched, manipulated, and threatened by forces that commanded resources far beyond normal academic or religious organizations. The mysterious Elena Vasquez and her associates represented something ancient and powerful, something that had been guarding these secrets for far longer than she had initially imagined. Sarah moved to her window and peered through the curtains at the street below, where ordinary evening traffic moved with the casual rhythms of modern life. But she could no longer trust in the ordinary, could no longer assume that the watchers were not among the watched. The symbols that had appeared in the Bodleian's manuscript, the fresh ink beside ancient text, the feeling of eyes upon her back, all of it spoke to a surveillance network that operated with patience measured in centuries rather than months. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The cathedral remembers St. Denis. Midnight. The message contained no signature, no identification, but somehow Sarah knew with absolute certainty that it came from someone connected to the Templar network. Whether ancient or modern, she could not say. The coincidence was too precise, the timing too perfect for mere chance. Someone who knew about her research, who understood the significance of her discoveries, was offering her the next piece of the puzzle. Sarah looked at her watch. 8:47 p.m. If she left immediately, she could reach St. Denis by the appointed time, though every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about the danger of following anonymous messages into deserted cathedrals at midnight. But the scholar in her, the part that had driven her to pursue medieval mysteries through years of obscure research, would not be denied. She gathered her camera, her notes, and the courage that had sustained her through a career of academic challenges, then stepped out into the London night to catch the last Eurostar to Paris. The Gothic spires of St. Denis Cathedral pierced the midnight sky like prayers made manifest in stone, their ancient bulk casting shadows that seemed to swallow the weak glow of street lights scattered around the basilica's perimeter. Dr. Sarah Chun stood in the doorway of an all-night cafe across from the cathedral's main entrance, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, while she watched for any sign of movement in the sacred precincts beyond. The September air carried the chill of approaching autumn, and Sarah pulled her jacket closer around her shoulders as she studied the cathedral that had been the burial place of French kings for more than 1,000 years. Somewhere within those ancient walls lay the tomb of St. Denis himself, the martyred bishop who had allegedly carried his own severed head to this spot and proclaimed it holy ground. But tonight, Sarah suspected she would discover secrets far stranger than any medieval legend. At 5 minutes before midnight, she crossed the empty street and approached the cathedral's north entrance, where a small door stood slightly ajar despite the late hour. The brass handle was warm to the touch, as if someone had recently passed this way, and the hinges moved without sound as Sarah stepped into the sacred darkness beyond. The interior of St. Denis stretched away into shadows that seemed to breathe with the accumulated prayers of centuries. Moonlight filtered through stained glass windows high above, casting pools of blue and gold and crimson on the stone floor where kings and queens lay in their marble tombs. The air was thick with the scent of incense and age, and Sarah's footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the altar, where a single votive candle burned like a star in the encompassing night. "Dr. Chun," came a voice from the shadows beside the tomb of Louis VII. "Thank you for coming." A figure emerged from the darkness, a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that held depths of knowledge accumulated over decades of careful study. He wore the simple black suit of a scholar or cleric, and his hands bore the ink stains that marked him as someone who spent his life working with ancient documents. "Professor Laurent Dubois," he introduced himself with a slight bow, "curator of medieval manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and keeper of certain collections that do not appear in any official catalogue." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You're the one who sent the message? You know about the Templar manuscripts?" Dubois nodded gravely. "I know about many things, Dr. Chun. I know about your discovery in the Pemberton collection, about your collaboration with Dr. Thorne at Cambridge, and about the rather unpleasant visit you received from Elena Vasquez and her associates. Could you possibly, because, my dear Dr. Chun, I am what you might call a hereditary curator. My family has been watching over certain materials for more than 7 centuries, passing the responsibility from father to son, generation to generation. We are the descendants of the Shadow Knights, and we have been waiting for scholars like yourself to rediscover what was hidden so long ago." Dubois gestured for her to follow him deeper into the cathedral, past the royal tombs toward a section of the building that felt older and more primitive than the Gothic grandeur of the main structure. The manuscripts you found in Oxford are genuine, but they represent only a fraction of what was preserved. The Shadow Knights were far more thorough in their preparations than most historians realize. They stopped before the tomb of Saint Denis, its ancient stonework worn smooth by the touch of countless pilgrims' hands. But Dubois was examining the base of the monument with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Here," he said, pressing his fingers against 3 small dots carved into the stone. "The mark that has guided my family for 30 generations." The stone panel slid aside with surprising ease, revealing stairs that descended into darkness older than the cathedral itself. Dubois produced a flashlight and began the descent, with Sarah following close behind, her heart pounding with excitement and terror in equal measure. The chamber they entered defied every expectation Sarah had formed about medieval hiding places. Rather than a simple vault or crypt, it was a complex of interconnected rooms carved from the living rock, their walls lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves, preserved in climate-controlled cases that spoke of modern conservation techniques, lay treasures that would rewrite the history of medieval Europe. "The complete archive," Dubois explained, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Documents, genealogies, artifacts, and relics gathered by the Templars over 2 centuries of careful searching. Everything they discovered about the bloodline, everything. They learned about the true history of early Christianity." Sarah moved from case to case like a woman in a dream, her trained eye immediately recognizing the significance of what she was seeing. Manuscripts in Aramaic and Greek that predated the canonical Gospels, genealogical charts that traced bloodlines from the 1st century to the present day, and artifacts that bore witness to truths that had been suppressed for nearly 2 millennia. "This genealogy," she whispered, stopping before a chart that showed family connections stretching across centuries. "It traces the descendants of Mary Magdalene through the Merovingian kings, through the nobility of medieval Europe, all the way to ... She paused, her breath catching as she read the names at the bottom of the chart. "These are modern people, living people." "The bloodline continues," Dubois confirmed, "hidden in plain sight, scattered across the world, unaware of their true heritage. The Shadow Knights have been watching over them for centuries, protecting them from those who would use their divine ancestry for political purposes or destroy them out of religious fanaticism." Sarah's mind raced with the implications. But if this is true, if the descendants of Christ are living among us, then the entire foundation of the Church ... would be called into question, Dubois finished. "Which is why my family and others like us have guarded these secrets so carefully. The world was not ready for such knowledge in the 14th century, and many would argue that it is not ready now." He led her to the center of the chamber, where a stone sarcophagus sat in solitary splendor. The inscription on its surface was, worn but still legible, "Maria Magdalena, Uxor Domini Nostri." Mary Magdalene, wife of our Lord. "She lies here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her earthly remains, yes. But her true legacy lives on in the bloodline she created, and the descendants who carry the divine spark in their very DNA." Dubois opened a case beside the sarcophagus and withdrew a scroll that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "The final genealogy, completed just last year, with modern genetic analysis. We now know with scientific certainty who carries the sacred blood. Sarah unrolled the scroll with trembling hands, her eyes scanning names and locations scattered across 6 continents. Teachers and artists, scientists and laborers, all unknowing inheritors of the most precious legacy in human history. At the bottom of the scroll, written in careful modern script, was a name that made her blood run cold. Dr. Sarah Chun, Oxford University. Probability, 89.7%. The scroll slipped from her nerveless fingers, and she stared at Dubois with eyes wide with shock and disbelief. This is impossible. I can't be. Your maternal grandmother was Chun Mei Lin, was she not? Born in Shanghai in 1920, emigrated to England in 1947. Dubois's voice was gentle but implacable. The bloodline traveled many paths over the centuries, Dr. Chun. Some led to European nobility, others to merchant families in Asia, still others to scholars and teachers who preserved knowledge in their own quiet ways. Sarah sank to her knees beside the sarcophagus, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what she had learned. All her life she had studied history as an outside observer, analyzing the past with scholarly detachment. Now she found herself part of that history, connected by blood to events that had shaped the world for 2 millennia. Why show me this? She asked. Why reveal the secret now? Dubois knelt beside her, his aged face grave with the weight of prophecy. Because the time of hiding is coming to an end, Dr. Chun. The old guardians are dying, the ancient networks are failing, and forces that have slept for centuries are beginning to stir. Elena Vasquez and her organization represent the churches. Final attempt to suppress this knowledge, but they are not the only ones who seek to control the bloodline. He gestured toward a modern computer terminal hidden among the ancient artifacts. Genetic analysis, DNA databases, family genealogy websites, modern technology is making it impossible to hide the truth much longer. Within a generation, anyone with access to the right databases will be able to trace the bloodlines and identify the descendants. Sarah looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much truth for one night. What do you want from me? Help us prepare for revelation, Dubois replied. Help us find the other descendants before our enemies do, and help us decide how and when to reveal the truth to a world that may not be ready to receive it. As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs above multiple sets of feet moving with military precision. The hidden chamber that had been sanctuary for 7 centuries was about to become a battleground, and Sarah found herself at the center of a conflict that had been brewing since the fall of the temple. Final game was about to begin. The footsteps descended the ancient stairs with the measured precision of soldiers advancing into battle, their echoes multiplying in the stone chambers until the very walls seemed to vibrate with approaching menace. Professor Dubois moved with surprising agility for a man of his years, his hands flying over hidden switches that activated security systems installed by generations of guardians. Emergency protocols, he explained tersely as steel barriers slid across several of the archival chambers with barely a whisper of sound. My family has had 7 centuries to prepare for this moment. Dr. Sarah Chun found herself caught between terror and fascination as she watched the medieval crypt transform into something resembling a high-tech bunker. Motion sensors activated pools of brilliant white light, Cameras emerged from cunningly concealed niches in the stone walls, and the gentle hum of climate control systems gave way to the more urgent whine of defensive electronics coming online. "Dr. Chung," came a familiar voice from the stairs. Elena Vasquez descended into the chamber with the confident stride of someone who had always expected to find herself in this exact place at this exact moment. Behind her came 6 men in dark tactical gear, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles, but their weapons clearly visible in the harsh light of the emergency illumination. "Miss Vasquez," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised to see you here." Elena smiled with the cold satisfaction of a chess master who had just achieved checkmate. "Did you really think we weren't monitoring your communications, Doctor? Did you imagine that 7 centuries of institutional experience could be defeated by academic curiosity and romantic notions about lost bloodlines?" She gestured to her armed companions, who spread out to cover the chamber's exits with professional efficiency. "The organization I represent has been cleaning up after Templar revelations for more than 700 years. We've prevented wars, toppled governments, and eliminated entire bloodlines when necessary to preserve the stability of Christendom." Professor Dubois stepped forward, his scholarly demeanor replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The Papal Guard Special Operations Division," he said, naming Elena's organization with obvious distaste. "We wondered when Rome would finally make its move." Rome? Sarah's mind raced to process this new information. The Vatican is behind this? The Vatican, the Jesuits, and certain elements within the intelligence services of several Catholic nations, Elena confirmed. "We are the sword and shield of the Church, tasked with protecting the faith from truths that would destroy it." She moved closer to the sarcophagus where Mary Magdalene lay in eternal rest, her eyes fixed on the ancient inscription with something that might have been reverence or revulsion. "Do you have any idea what would happen if the world learned that Christ was married, that he fathered children, that his bloodline continues to this day?" "The truth would set humanity free," Dubois replied firmly. "Free from the artificial barriers between divine and mortal. Free from the guilt and shame that have poisoned Christianity for 2 millennia. Elena's laugh echoed harshly off the stone walls. "The truth would destroy civilization as we know it. Billions of believers would lose their faith overnight. The Church would collapse, taking with it the moral foundation of Western society. Chaos, war, and the triumph of atheistic materialism is that the legacy you want to leave behind." Sarah found her voice driven by a scholar's instinct to seek understanding even in the face of mortal danger. "So you've been hunting the descendants for centuries? Killing them to preserve the Church's version of truth?" "When necessary," Elena confirmed without visible emotion. "Though we prefer more subtle methods when possible. Arranged accidents, untraceable illnesses, carefully orchestrated tragedies that remove bloodline carriers from the gene pool without attracting unwanted attention." The casual admission of systematic murder hung in the air like poison, and Sarah felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. These people had spent centuries destroying human lives to protect their institutional power, and they would not hesitate to add her name to their list of victims. "But you made a mistake," Dubois said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had been preparing for this confrontation all his life. "You assumed that we were merely scholars. and archivists, guardians of dusty manuscripts and ancient relics. He pressed a sequence of symbols carved into the wall beside the sarcophagus, and the chamber filled with the soft hiss of gas being released from hidden vents. Elena's men immediately raised their weapons, but Dubois held up a hand in a gesture of reassurance. "Merely a mild sedative," he explained, "derived from compounds known to the medieval alchemists, refined by modern chemistry, and quite harmless to those who have taken the proper antidote." Elena staggered as the gas took effect, her confident expression replaced by confusion and growing alarm. Around her, the tactical team began to sway and stumble, their weapons clattering to the stone floor as their nervous systems succumbed to the ancient knowledge of the Shadow Knights. "You see," Dubois continued conversationally, as he fitted breathing masks over his own face and Sarah's, "the original Templars were not just warrior monks. They were also scholars, alchemists, and physicians who learned their arts in the libraries of Constantinople and the laboratories of Damascus. We have had 7 centuries to perfect their formulations." As Elena and her team collapsed into unconsciousness, new figures emerged from hidden passages that Sarah had not even noticed. Men and women of various ages and nationalities, all bearing the calm confidence of those who had trained for this moment since childhood. The modern inheritors of the Shadow Knights, guardians who had preserved the bloodline through centuries of persecution and threat. "The genetic analysis was correct," said a woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold starlight. "Dr. Chun carries the sacred blood, as do 13 others currently living in various parts of the world. The bloodline has survived, despite our enemy's best efforts to eradicate it." Sarah looked around the chamber at faces that reflected her own mixed heritage, European, Asian, African, and combinations that spoke to the global reach of the ancient diaspora. "How many of us are there?" 14 confirmed carriers of the direct maternal line," replied a man whose accent suggested origins in the American South. "Perhaps twice that number if we include the paternal descendants whose lines have been harder to trace." Dubois activated a communications system that connected them to Shadow Knight cells around the world, and Sarah watched screens light up with faces from every continent. The network that had begun with 5 desperate knights fleeing through the forests of France had grown into a global organization dedicated to preserving humanity's most precious secret. "The time of hiding is over," announced a woman whose voice carried the authority of command. "Elena Vasquez's people have forced our hand, and we can no longer maintain the fiction that the bloodline is lost or extinct. We must choose between revelation and extinction." Sarah found herself thrust into the center of a debate that had been raging for 7 centuries. Some argued for immediate public disclosure, using modern media and genetic science to present irrefutable proof of Christ's bloodline. Others favored a more gradual approach, working through academic channels and religious reformers to prepare the world for truths that would shatter fundamental assumptions about the nature of divinity. But as the debate raged around her, Sarah's attention was drawn to the sarcophagus where Mary Magdalene lay in eternal rest. Somewhere in the genetic structure of the woman's ancient bones lay the biological proof of humanity's divine heritage, the physical evidence that would transform faith from belief into scientific fact. "There's a third option," Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the heated discussion. We don't reveal the truth to the world, we let the world discover it for itself. The chamber fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, family history research, the tools are already available for anyone who knows how to use them. Instead of making grand pronouncements that will be dismissed as fantasy or fraud, we seed the information into existing databases and let researchers make their own discoveries. Dubois smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. Precisely what my family has been preparing for these past decades. We have genetic samples, historical documentation, and archaeological evidence scattered across a dozen legitimate research institutions. When the time is right, when the world is ready, the truth will emerge naturally from multiple sources. And until then? Sarah asked. We wait, Dubois replied. We watch. And we protect the bloodline from those who would use it for their own purposes, whether divine or diabolic. As Elena Vasquez and her team were secured for transport to facilities where they would be held until the larger conflict was resolved, Sarah realized that she had become part of something far larger than academic research. She was now a guardian of humanity's most precious secret, a keeper of truths that would reshape civilization itself. The Shadow Knights had survived for 7 centuries, and they would survive for 7 more if necessary. But for the first time since the fall of the temple, revelation seemed closer than extinction. The blood of Christ flowed still in mortal veins, and the world was almost ready to know. 5 years later, October 13th, 2029, the autumn rain fell like tears of remembrance upon the stones of St. Denis Cathedral, each droplet carrying echoes of ceremonies, both sacred and secret, that had played out beneath these ancient vaults for more than 7 centuries. In the hidden chamber far below the royal tombs, Dr. Sarah Chun stood before a wall of monitors that displayed data streams from research institutions around the world, watching as the truth slowly emerged from decades of careful preparation. The revelation had begun as she had predicted, not with grand announcements or dramatic press conferences, but with the quiet accumulation of scientific evidence that made denial increasingly impossible. A genealogical study published by the University of Edinburgh had traced unusual genetic markers through European noble houses. A carbon dating analysis at Cambridge had confirmed the authenticity of first-century artifacts found in French archaeological sites. A DNA study conducted by the Smithsonian had identified blood proteins on ancient chalices that matched samples from known descendants of Middle Eastern populations. Each discovery stood alone as an interesting but unremarkable piece of academic research. Together, they painted a picture that was beginning to capture the attention of journalists, historians, and religious scholars around the world. The bloodline of Christ was emerging from myth into documented reality, and the implications were rippling through institutions that had shaped human civilization for 2 millennia. The Vatican issued another statement today, reported Marcus Thorne, who had joined the Shadow Knights after his own encounter with Elena Vasquez 5 years earlier. His expertise in medieval cryptography had proven invaluable in authenticating documents and artifacts that supported the bloodline research. They're calling for caution in interpreting preliminary genetic data, warning against conclusions that exceed the scope of available evidence. Sarah nodded without surprise. The Catholic Church's response had been predictably measured, not quite denial, but certainly not acknowledgement. Behind the scenes, she knew, factions within the Vatican were engaged in heated debates about how to address revelations that threatened to transform Christianity itself. And the other churches? She asked. More receptive generally, Marcus replied. The Anglicans are calling for further study. The Presbyterians are emphasizing the humanity of Christ, and several Orthodox patriarchates have issued statements suggesting that the divine nature of Christ would not be diminished by earthly marriage and parenthood. Professor Dubois, now in his 70s, but still sharp as a blade, looked up from a medieval manuscript he was examining. The truth has its own momentum now, he observed. We have done our work of preparation, and the world is beginning to do the work of acceptance. The chamber around them had evolved over the past 5 years from a hidden archive into a sophisticated research center where ancient knowledge met cutting-edge technology. Genetic analysis equipment stood beside medieval reliquaries. Computer servers hummed in harmony with stone vaults that had witnessed the prayers of saints and kings, and scholars from around the world collaborated on projects that would have been impossible in any official academic setting. The other confirmed descendants of the bloodline had gradually been contacted and brought into the network. 14 individuals whose genetic heritage connected them directly to the sacred lineage that had shaped human history for 2 millennia. They came from every walk of life. A teacher in Tokyo whose grandmother had carried the sacred genes from ancient migrations across Asia. A carpenter in Brazil whose lineage traced back through Spanish nobility to the Merovingian kings. A nurse in Seattle whose family had preserved the bloodline through centuries of quiet, faith, and careful breeding. Each had brought their own skills and perspectives to the work of revelation, but all shared the profound responsibility of carrying within their very selves the biological proof of humanity's divine heritage. They were living relics, breathing testaments to truths that had been hidden since the crucifixion itself. Dr. Chung, came a voice from one of the communication stations. We're receiving a priority transmission from our colleagues in Jerusalem. Sarah moved to the monitor where Professor Rachel Ben David of Hebrew University appeared via encrypted video link. The Israeli archaeologist's face was flushed with excitement, and behind her, Sarah could see the controlled chaos of an active excavation site. Sarah, we found it, Rachel announced without preamble. The burial site mentioned in the 3rd century codex. The genetic matches are perfect maternal DNA that links directly to the bloodline samples we've been analyzing. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 5 years they had been working with historical documents and genetic analysis, building their case through careful accumulation of circumstantial evidence. But this discovery promised something far more direct: physical remains that could provide definitive proof of the sacred marriage and its offspring. How much time do we have before the site becomes public knowledge? Sarah asked. Maybe weeks, possibly days, Rachel replied. The Israeli Antiquities Authority is involved, which means government oversight and international attention. We need to complete our analysis quickly and quietly before this becomes a media circus. Dubois joined the conversation, his aged voice carrying the weight of 7 centuries of planning. Then the time has come for full revelation, he said. We can no longer control the pace of discovery, so we must ensure that the truth emerges complete and undeniable. Over the following hours, Sarah watched as the global network of Shadow Knights activated protocols that had been in development for decades. Research papers that had been written years in advance were submitted to peer-reviewed journals. Documentary evidence that had been verified and authenticated was released to news organizations. Genetic data that had been carefully compiled was made available to scientific databases around the world. The revelation unfolded with the measured precision of a symphony, each piece of evidence complementing and reinforcing the others until denial became impossible and acceptance inevitable. Within 72 hours, the bloodline of Christ had transformed from medieval legend into scientific fact, supported by genetic analysis, archaeological evidence, and historical documentation that spanned 2 millennia. The response was everything the Shadow Knights had anticipated and more. Religious leaders struggled to address the implications for traditional doctrine. Scientists rushed to verify and expand upon the genetic research. Historians raced to re-examine the origins of Christianity in light of new evidence. The media treated it as the story of the century, with coverage that ranged from thoughtful analysis to sensational speculation. But for Sarah, standing in the chamber where Mary Magdalene lay in eternal rest, the most profound response came from ordinary people around the world who found in the revelation not the destruction of their faith, but its transformation into something richer and more complete. The divine had touched the human not once in a moment of miraculous conception, but continuously through a bloodline that connected heaven and earth across the centuries. 3 months later, the crowds that gathered outside St. Denis Cathedral were unlike any the ancient building had seen in its 1,000-year history. Pilgrims and skeptics, scientists and believers, journalists and scholars, all drawn by the knowledge that within these walls lay proof of humanity's divine heritage made manifest in bone and blood. An ancient stone. Dr. Sarah Chun stood at the window of her temporary office in the cathedral's administrative building, watching the sea of humanity that ebbed and flowed beyond the security barriers like a living testament to the power of revealed truth. The genetic evidence had been verified by laboratories on 6 continents. The archaeological discoveries had been authenticated by the world's leading experts, and the historical documentation had withstood the scrutiny of the most rigorous academic review. The bloodline of Christ was no longer a matter of faith. It was a matter of scientific fact. "The Pope has requested a private audience," Marcus Thorne announced from the doorway, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and apprehension. "His Holiness will arrive this evening, along with a delegation from the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences." Sarah turned from the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass that separated her from the crowds below. 3 months of intensive media attention had aged her more than the previous 5 years of careful research. The weight of being not just a scholar studying the bloodline, but a living member of it, had transformed her from an academic observer into a reluctant prophet. "What does he want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "To see the evidence for himself," Marcus replied, "and to discuss what this means for the future of the Church." Professor Dubois emerged from the elevator that connected the administrative offices to the hidden chambers below, his aged face bearing the satisfaction of a man who had lived to see the completion of his life's work. The sacred relics have been prepared for His Holiness's examination. He reported. The sarcophagus of the Magdalene, the genealogical records, the Grail itself, all of it available for whatever tests he wishes to conduct. Sarah felt the irony of the situation wash over her like cold water. For 7 centuries, the shadow. Knights had hidden from the Vatican's agents, preserving the bloodline and its secrets from those who would destroy them. Now the Pope himself was coming to kneel before the tomb they had guarded so faithfully. How do you think he'll respond? She asked Dubois. When he sees the proof, when he understands that everything his church has taught about the nature of Christ must be reconsidered. The old professor smiled with the wisdom of years spent studying the complexities of human nature. Pope Francis is a remarkable man, he observed. A scholar, a reformer, a leader who has already shown willingness to challenge traditional doctrine when it conflicts with broader truths. If anyone can guide the Church through this transformation, it is he. As evening approached, bringing with it the papal entourage that would arrive under cover of darkness to avoid the media circus surrounding the cathedral, Sarah made her way down to the hidden chambers where the greatest secrets in human history lay waiting for their moment of ultimate revelation. The stone steps felt different beneath her feet now that she knew she was walking in the footsteps of her own ancestors, medieval knights, who had carried the sacred blood through centuries of persecution, scholars who had preserved the truth when revelation meant death, guardians who had passed the responsibility from generation to generation until it reached her own reluctant hands. In the central chamber, the sarcophagus of Mary Magdalene gleamed like captured starlight beneath the modern illumination that had replaced medieval candles. Around it stood the other confirmed descendants of the bloodline, 14 souls who had discovered that their DNA carried the echoes of divinity itself. They had come from around the world for this moment, drawn by a sense of destiny that transcended their individual lives and connected them to something infinitely larger than themselves. At precisely 9 o'clock, the elevator descended, carrying a small group of figures whose presence seemed to transform the ancient chamber into something approaching the throne room. Pope Francis emerged first, his weathered face bearing the gravity appropriate to a moment that would reshape Christianity itself. Behind him came Cardinal Luis Ladaria, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and Dr. Marcelo Faith. Sanchez Sarando, Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. The Pope approached the sarcophagus with the measured steps of a man who understood that he was walking toward a confrontation with truths that would challenge everything he had believed about the nature of his faith. His hands, marked by years of humble service, trembled slightly as he read the inscription that declared Mary Magdalene to be the wife of Christ. "Your Holiness," Sarah said, stepping forward to serve as guide and interpreter, "the genetic analysis has confirmed that the remains within this sarcophagus carry DNA markers that match the bloodline descendants. The carbon dating places the burial in the 1st century CE, and the chemical analysis of preserved tissue shows markers consistent with a Middle Eastern origin." Pope Francis nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the ancient stone that held such profound implications for his church. "And the genealogical records?" Dubois approached with a reverence that spoke to a lifetime of scholarship and faith. "Complete lineages from the 1st century to the present day, Your Holiness. cross-referenced with historical documents, genetic analysis, and archaeological evidence. The bloodline has survived, scattered across the globe, but never extinct. The Pope studied the genealogical charts with the careful attention of a scholar examining primary sources, his finger tracing bloodlines that connected the sacred to the secular across 2 millennia of human history. When he reached the names of the living descendants, his eyes found Sarah's face with an intensity that seemed to see, through her scholarly exterior, to the divine heritage that flowed in her veins. "Dr. Chung," he said softly, "you carry within your very being the genetic legacy of our Lord Jesus Christ. How does this knowledge change your understanding of faith?" Sarah had been dreading this question for months, knowing that her answer would be scrutinized by theologians and philosophers for generations to come. "Your Holiness," she replied carefully, "I believe it makes faith more real, not less. The divine touched the human not as an abstract concept, but as a living reality that continues to this day. We are all children of God, but some of us carry that relationship in our very DNA." The Pope was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the sarcophagus to the genealogical records to the faces of the living descendants, who stood before him like a living bridge between heaven and earth. When he finally spoke, his words carried the authority of one who spoke for nearly 2 billion believers around the world. "The Church has always taught that Christ was both fully divine and fully human," he said. "This discovery does not diminish his divinity, it confirms his humanity in ways we never imagined possible. If our Lord was truly human, then he experienced all the joys and responsibilities of human life, including the sacred bond of marriage and the blessing of children." Cardinal Ladaria stepped forward, his face bearing the concern of one whose life's work had been the preservation of orthodox doctrine. "Your Holiness, the implications for traditional teaching will require careful consideration and prayerful reflection," the Pope agreed. "But we cannot turn away from truth simply because it challenges our comfortable assumptions. The Church has faced such moments before, when we learned that the earth revolves around the sun, when we discovered the age of the universe, when we accepted the reality of evolution. Truth does not threaten faith, it enriches it." The Pope moved closer to the sarcophagus, placing his hand on the ancient stone where Mary Magdalene had rested for nearly 2,000 years. She who was first to witness the resurrection, first to proclaim the good news, first to know the risen Christ. That she was also his beloved wife, his partner in the sacred work of redemption, seems not a scandal, but a blessing. Dr. Sanchez. Sorondo produced a tablet computer and began documenting the chamber's contents with the methodical thoroughness of a scientist recording history in the making. "The genetic evidence will need to be reviewed by independent laboratories," he noted. "The historical documentation will require verification by paleographers and medievalists. But if these findings are confirmed, they will transform our understanding of Christianity itself," the Pope completed. "And we will meet that transformation with the courage of our convictions and the wisdom of our faith." As the papal delegation prepared to depart, taking with them samples and documentation that would be subjected to the most rigorous analysis the Vatican could provide, Pope Francis paused before Sarah with a final observation. "Dr. Chung, you and your fellow descendants carry a responsibility greater than any earthly throne," he said. You are living testaments to the reality of the Incarnation, proof that the divine and human are not separate realms, but part of a seamless whole. Use this gift wisely, and help humanity understand that we are all participants in the sacred story that began in a carpenter's shop in Nazareth.